You ever hear someone laugh and then realize, deep in your gut, that the laugh was covering up something far darker? That's what it felt like when Billy Crystal stepped away from the camera that day. His face, so familiar to millions, tightened just for a moment. His hands trembled slightly. The crew assumed the interview was over. The microphones were still hot. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And then he said it. It was quiet, almost like a whisper to himself, but it carried weight, a kind of sorrow that doesn't just come from mourning, it comes from guilt. He said, "I should have said something years ago, after what I saw him do to Nick." Pause. Now, let's not pretend we know what he meant by that. Not fully. Not yet. But when someone like Billy Crystal says something like that, about someone like Rob Reiner, it's not nothing. It sticks. It stays. And when, just weeks later, Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were found brutally stabbed in their multi-million-dollar Brentwood estate, and their son Nick was arrested, that whisper turned into something else entirely. A question. A scream. Because what if the narrative we've all been handed? The shocking murder, the deranged son, the picture-perfect Hollywood family torn apart by mental illness. Isn't the whole story? What if it never was? Let me ask you this. How do you define a monster? Is it someone who kills? Or someone who creates the conditions for that killing, then smiles for the cameras? We're diving into a case that, on its surface, seems tragically simple. A son kills his parents. A wealthy family hides dysfunction. Another Hollywood tragedy. But the more we pull at the threads, the more tangled things become. And the one person who might have warned us, who maybe tried to warn us, is the last person anyone expected. Billy Crystal. Yes, that Billy Crystal. Mr. When Harry Met Sally. Mr. Oscar's monologue. Mr. America's favorite uncle. Turns out he wasn't just an entertainer. He was a witness to something dark, something buried, something dangerous. And if you're thinking this is just another celebrity scandal, don't. Because this isn't just about fame, or dysfunction, or even murder. This is about silence. Complicity. The cost of protecting power. This is about what happens when someone tries to speak, and nobody listens. We'll walk you through everything. The crime scene. The family dynamics. The deeply uncomfortable contradictions in Nick Reiner's life story. The therapists who raised alarms. The friends who disappeared. The sealed files. And of course, Billy Crystal's final, unguarded words. But we're not going to rush this. Because this story, it doesn't unfold in headlines. It unfolds in hesitation. In glances. In the subtle tremor of a voice that's carried too much for too long. So here's what we know so far. Sunday night. Brentwood, California. The kind of estate you only see in magazines. Tall hedges. Guarded gates. Enough silence to make the truth echo louder. Inside that estate, two bodies. Rob Reiner. Michelle Reiner. Multiple stab wounds. No sign of forced entry. The alarm system wasn't triggered. But the lights were still on. In the guest house, just steps away, their son Nick Reiner was found, blood on his hands, sitting at the foot of his bed. Silent. Numb. Incoherent. Police arrested him without resistance. By morning, the media had already written the headline. Troubled son kills Hollywood icon. It's easy to accept. Neat. Clean. Digestible. But truth rarely works that way. Because here's what didn't make it into those early reports. Romy Reiner, Nick's younger sister, was the one who discovered the bodies. And when officers asked her what happened, she didn't say, "Nick did it." She said, "There's someone dangerous here. You need to find them." That's a direct quote. Now, ask yourself, why didn't she just point to her brother? Was it fear? Was it denial? Or was it something else entirely? See, Romy has been quiet since then. No social media, no interviews. And according to sources close to the family, she's refused to speak with Nick since the arrest, but she also hasn't visited the estate either. Not once. That silence, it doesn't feel like grief. It feels like strategy. And here's where things begin to twist. Because days after the murder, an insider on the set of a Billy Crystal retrospective, someone who asked not to be named, leaked the audio. Yes, that audio. The one where Crystal, thinking the mics were off, spoke, finally, about something he claimed to have witnessed decades ago. A moment between Rob and Nick. Violent. Unprovoked. Cruel, he called it. And the question now becomes, was Nick Reiner always a ticking time bomb? Or was he built piece by piece. By the very man who called himself a hero? Let's take a breath here. It's tempting to leap to conclusions, to look for villains, to make sense of the chaos. But the truth is, every person in this story holds contradictions. Rob Reiner was a beloved director and political activist. He gave millions of people hope and inspiration. He also, according to Crystal and others, may have been a deeply controlling father with a history of rage. Nick Reiner was a privileged son, a screenwriter, a recovering addict. He was also, allegedly, bruised, diagnosed, discarded. And Billy Crystal? He was the friend who watched it all unfold from a distance, until he couldn't anymore. The hardest part of this story is not knowing where the line is, between victim and aggressor, between trauma and accountability, between what was real and what was performed. And that's why this expose exists. Because in the days ahead, you're going to hear a lot of noise. Experts, pundits, influencers. Everyone will have a theory, a motive, a moment. But buried beneath all of that is something else. Something that won't show up on police reports. Something you'll only see if you slow down and listen, really listen, to the silences, the glances, the things that weren't said until it was too late. That's where this story lives. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this story apart. Gently, carefully. We'll lay out each piece, the home videos, the therapy records, the legal motions, the interviews, the anonymous tips. We'll ask hard questions. Was Nick telling the truth about the abuse? Why did Michelle Reiner reportedly keep a private diary that never mentioned her husband once in the final year of her life? Why did Rob Reiner try to have Nick legally committed just months before the murder? And why did the court deny the request? Why did Billy Crystal go silent for so long? And what finally broke him? And most importantly, what did Romy Reiner see that made her say, "There's someone dangerous here"? Each chapter ahead peels back another layer. Each one brings us closer to the question nobody wants to ask. Not, did Nick kill his parents? But, why didn't anyone stop this from happening? Why did it have to go this far? Why did nobody listen? This is not a story about a Hollywood murder. It's a story about a Hollywood secret. A secret that was whispered in the quietest voice. By a man who built his life making people laugh. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They say trauma doesn't announce itself. But on that night in Brentwood, it didn't whisper, either. It screamed. You want to know what really happened that night? Not the filtered, repackaged version fed to the press, but the raw, staggering details that the security footage didn't catch. The eerie pauses between motions, the breath that never came, the house that felt too still, even for the dead. Because before the headlines, before the mugshot, before the world turned its back on Nick Reiner, there was a light still on in the Reiner family's kitchen, a dim glow spilling across marble countertops. And somewhere inside that $13.5 million mansion, something unspeakable had already happened. But the world didn't know it yet. Romy did. She was the first one to walk through that door. And what she saw? No. Let's take a step back. Let's not rush this. Because that night wasn't just blood and sirens. It was a carefully choreographed moment of unraveling. And it started long before the police arrived. Earlier that evening, Romy Reiner had tried calling her mother. Nothing urgent, just a routine check-in. A habit. Maybe even an excuse to stay connected in a house where connection had long since rotted. No answer. She waited, then tried again. Still nothing. An hour passed. Then two. She drove over. Maybe she shouldn't have. Maybe something inside her already knew. But she did anyway. And what she found was wrong. Not in the obvious way. Not at first. It was the kind of wrong you feel before you see. The gate was half closed. That never happened. The front door was ajar. Again, unusual. Not alarming. Not enough to call 911. But just enough to pause. Just enough to hold your breath. She stepped inside. Shoes on. That says a lot right there. Romy had always been the kind of person who respected space. Boundaries. Rules. But that night, she didn't hesitate. She moved through the foyer, slowly. Called out once. Then again. No response. And then, silence. Not just quiet. Dead silence. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind you carry in your chest like a stone. She turned left into the hallway. That's where the family portraits were. Rob with the cast of All in the Family. Michelle at a gala with her arm gently curled around Billy Crystal's. Nick, age 12, holding a dog whose name no one remembers anymore. There was one photo missing. That was the first thing Romy noticed. It had been taken down. The outline of dust made its absence obvious. But that wasn't what made her reach for her phone. That came when she entered the living room. Now, this part gets complicated. And there are things we still don't know. Things the police won't confirm, and Romy has refused to speak publicly about. But based on the initial incident report, here's what can be pieced together. Rob Reiner was found slumped over the edge of the living room couch. His feet were still on the ground, as if he'd been standing when the first blow hit. There was blood, but not where you'd expect it. Not in pools. In patterns. Lines. Almost deliberate. Michelle was on the staircase, 2 steps from the top. As if she'd been trying to get away. That detail matters. She wasn't in bed. She wasn't downstairs. She was in motion. Mid-flight. And then, nothing. A knife was recovered in the kitchen sink. Clean. Too clean. It had been run under hot water. The drain was still wet. Whoever did this didn't panic. Let that sit for a moment. Because that's not how unhinged crimes of passion usually unfold. This wasn't a frantic act. This was precise. Quiet. Cold. And then there's the timing. According to coroner's estimates, Rob and Michelle died roughly 30 minutes before Romy arrived. Which means, yeah, you see where this is going. Nick Reiner was still there. Not hiding. Not fleeing. Not attempting to escape. He was in the guest house. Sitting. Staring. Unmoving. When officers later interviewed Romy, she reportedly told them, "I didn't even want to check. I knew something was wrong. I knew someone was still there." That statement gets misquoted a lot. Twisted to suggest she knew Nick was the killer. But that's not what she said. She didn't name anyone. She said, someone. Then she said, dangerous. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't try to wake him. She just called 911, walked outside, and waited. Calm. Focused. Almost rehearsed. That's what one of the responding officers allegedly wrote in his notes. Her demeanor was clear-headed. Not panicked. Not in shock. Now, to be fair, everyone reacts to trauma differently. But that night, that reaction, it raised eyebrows. And it planted a seed of doubt in the minds of detectives that never quite went away. Nick, on the other hand, didn't say a word. Not when they arrived. Not when they cuffed him. Not even when they showed him the knife. He blinked slowly, looked down at his hands, then back up. He reportedly said, "Did they find the camera?" That line, 6 words, changed the direction of the investigation. Because what camera? There was no camera found on the scene. At least, not yet. That question suggested there was footage. Evidence. Something that could exonerate or implicate him. But detectives couldn't find it. Not in the main house. Not in his guest quarters. Not even on the cloud servers linked to the Reiner's security system. It was just gone. Like it had been wiped. But Nick believed it existed. Why? Why ask about something you knew wasn't there, unless it had been? Let's step back for a moment. You might be asking, how does someone go from writing movies and attending film festivals to this? How does the son of one of Hollywood's most celebrated directors wind up at the center of a double homicide? And here's where it gets murky. Because what happened that night may have started years ago, long before the blood, long before the knife. It may have started with a bruise, or a scream, or a door slammed just a little too hard, and someone choosing to look the other way. You see, there are stories buried in the Reiner household. Whispers. Things said behind closed doors. Housekeepers who stayed only a few months. Tutors who refused to comment. Therapists who, well, we'll get to that later. But here's what matters right now. Romy didn't cry. Not that night. Not in front of officers. Not during the questioning. She was quiet. Still. Almost removed. And one of the first things she said, after identifying the bodies, after confirming the knife, after pointing them to her brother, was this. They didn't deserve it, but it wasn't random. Think about that. Not, he snapped. Not, I don't understand. She said, it wasn't random. So what did she know? And more importantly, what was she trying not to say? We know that Nick had been staying in the guest house for almost 8 months by then. It wasn't by choice. His parents had reportedly refused to let him back into the main house after a violent outburst earlier that year. We also know there were multiple calls to the property in the months leading up to the murders, noise complaints, suspected domestic disturbances, one anonymous call reporting a man screaming threats in the backyard. No arrests were made. No statements were filed. Just warnings. And here's the detail that never made the news. One of those 911 calls. It came from inside the house. A woman refused to give her name, hung up before officers could respond. When they traced the call, it came from Romy's cell. And just like that, the walls start to crack. Because maybe this wasn't just a breakdown. Maybe this was a detonation. Built, primed, and sealed behind Hollywood smiles for decades. So when Nick sat in the back of that cruiser, hands trembling, eyes wide, staring at nothing, maybe he wasn't in shock. Maybe he was remembering something. Something he thought had ended years ago. Something he thought he'd survived, but hadn't. And if that's the case, then the real story doesn't start with the murders. It starts with a question. Who was Nick Reiner before the blood?